The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu famously said the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Another philosopher said the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a broken fan belt and a flat tire. In my family, the journey of 1,000 miles usually began an hour late, wondering what we forgot this time and how long it would be to the nearest restroom. As far back as I can remember, every time my family took a major trip in the car, my mom and dad would round my sister up and I up just before leaving to offer a prayer for God's safekeeping and blessing for our journey. At times, it happened in the front hallway as we gathered our last items for the trip. And other times it took place in the car just before my dad turned the ignition on. And most times, we recited Psalm 121 together. Whenever my sister and I were leaving home on some major endeavor, to camp, on a mission trip, back to college in the fall, on a motorcycle trip cross country, the summer of my junior year, whatever the journey, Psalm 121 led the way. It's been called the Traveler's Psalm. And of all the Psalms of Ascent, it's probably the most well-known. It's a pretty simple psalm if you outline it. If you break it down, you find that the first two verses are spoken by the one who's about to take this trip, about to travel. And the last 6 verses are spoken by the one who is staying behind. You'll see that if you look at your Psalter. And it's an interaction between these two that is full of assurance and encouragement. It's not hard to imagine. Is it someone about to depart on a journey? Maybe a long hike to Jerusalem for a festival, but perhaps a journey of a different kind. And there are many different kinds of journeys, aren't there? CPC is on a journey. Pastor Dale and Marlene are on a journey as well. Different, but equally fraught with challenges and unknowns. But you can't imagine a traveler asking, where can I find help if I run into difficulty? It's a natural question. Whether one's thinking of a geographic journey through a dangerous territory or through bad weather, a lifelong journey with many ups and downs, or a spiritual journey to seek and discover ourselves or God or both. Journeys can be full of excitement, but also full of dangers. There are physical dangers, disease, injury, accident, war, natural disasters, infirmity. There are economic dangers, recessions, depressions, unemployment, outsourcing, downsizing, insolvency, debt, theft, and spiritual dangers, denial, doubt, sin, evil, alienation, extremism, complacency. There are all kinds of hazards and perils, menaces and vulnerabilities in life. In fact, why don't we take a moment right now for you to name to yourself the 2 greatest fears or threats that presently face you or a loved one. with all these real and possible dangers, there is no more natural question for anyone living to ask than, where will I find help? If they're not too proud to actually ask. Too many in our day think asking for help is a sign of weakness, don't they? In this age of independence and self-help and self-sufficiency, asking where one might find help and actually uttering the cry for help can be extremely difficult. I mean, we believe we're the ones keeping our own lives together, don't we? This is the message we get from our culture. From balancing our checkbooks to staying on top of our medical appointments, we are in charge of our well-being. We are responsible for our own lives. We are the captains of our own destinies. And so crying out for help, asking where our help is to come from, can be seen as a sign of weakness or even irresponsibility. But from the perspective of faith, crying for help is an act of acknowledging our powerlessness, which is an act of strength. It's an act of giving up our incessant need for control and surrendering ourselves to the will and the power of God. It's an act of fully trusting and fully relying on God. And in that act of crying for help, you can hear the voice of your heart joining in this ancient song. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. This is the psalmist's cry. She answers her own question about help with a confession of faith. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. You can just see her trekking her way towards Mount Zion, where the temple rests in Jerusalem, with all these other travelers, their hearts full of expectation. As the writer of Psalm 48 puts it, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, Jerusalem. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King. Within her citadels, God has made himself known as a fortress. And looking up, she sees all the awesome, solid-looking mountains and imposing hills along the way. Yet she doesn't look to them or to nature for help. The hills, after all, might be hiding some threat, some predator or thief, or maybe worse, on top of many of the hills on the way to Jerusalem were altars to foreign gods, false gods. She realizes that you have to look beyond the hills to God, the one who made the hills and the heaven and the earth. It is God, the creator and sustainer of all that is, who gives the help needed in the most challenging times and situations. God works in ways that give us collective help as the people of God, and individual help for the specific journey we each find ourselves traversing. And like the pilgrims of old, our journeys intertwine with those around us. Sometimes we walk alongside each other, sometimes we are alone. But no matter what the situation, we can rest in the assurance that when needed, help will come from the Lord. The one who made the heaven and the earth is the same one who is ready, able, and willing to come alongside and aid you in me and our journeys when we're in trouble, when you need to find a place of safety and rest. This is the conviction and the confession in these first few verses spoken by the one who is setting out on a journey to Jerusalem. The remainder of the psalm, as we mentioned earlier, is really a response of a friend or perhaps a priest who is staying behind. And he encourages the traveler to continue to trust in God by giving 3 examples of the ways God cares for those on the journey. Each example is centered on the Lord as our keeper. 6 times the writer uses the word keep or keeper. We don't merely belong to God. We are God's beloved. We are immeasurably dear to God. And so God cares and keeps us. He will not suffer your foot to move. He will not let your foot slip. How many of you have ever walked down a steep slope or a narrow ledge with loose stones or rocks underfoot? It's hazardous. It's scary. The promise, however, that God will not let your foot be moved is a tricky one for us to understand, because we want it to be saying that God will never let anything bad happen to us. But unfortunately, part of living in a world that's still plagued by sin is dealing with difficulty and suffering, whether it's created by our own sins and misjudgments or caused by things beyond our control that are nonetheless ours to endure. Nevertheless, when life feels hazardous, scary, God is there constantly, continually. In fact, he watches over you. The one who watches over you will not slumber. God never sleeps on the job. He's never on duty part-time. He never has to take a nap or a coffee break. As we journey through life, there is never one moment when he is not aware of every need of those on the journey. He's not like those so-called gods of the nations, the ones on the hills that were not always available to help individuals in need. You remember the story of Elijah, the prophet, in that contest with the priests of Baal, telling them to shout ever more louder for Baal's help, since he seemed to be sleeping, and he never awakened. Not so for us. We sleep, but our God is always awake and alert. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. Traveling through Palestine would bring prospects of very hot, a baking kind of sun in the daylight and shivering cold in the moonlight. The sun and the moon stand for the dangers that come in the day and the night. God is there to shield us, to give us courage. We're also told that God protects us from all evil. And again, to be protected from all evil does not imply a trouble-free life. It simply means that the troubles that do come will not do us in and will not separate us from God's love and personal presence. It's important to recognize that the psalmist's confidence in God is one that assumes that there will be those times of need, times when help is required. How can God be called a helper unless there are instances when we need God's help? And the child of God is not promised freedom from tribulation or challenge or storm. What's promised is that for all those who hope in God, none of these trials will ever separate us from God's presence and love. The prophet Isaiah says something similar when he writes, when you pass through the waters, he's talking about roaring waters here, floods, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flame will not consume you, for I am your God. As Jesus himself promises, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Bottom line, we can be confident that God is for us and with us all our lives, in the whole of our comings and our goings, big and small. From when you rise up and you leave home in the morning to when you return in the evening, God is there throughout, keeping watch, ready to stand by your side through both the joys and the pains that you might experience, whether you have it all figured out or not, whether you feel like God is present or not. Even in the brokenness that defines so much of our world, we have a God that does not let us linger on our own. God is there to keep your life. There's another inspiring passage from Isaiah. The verses at the end are well known. You'll recognize those. And it parallels Psalm 121. It begins by asking us to raise our eyes to the night sky. I'm going to read it as a closing. Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength and mighty in power. Not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, O Christ Presbyterian Church, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The Lord is our keeper. Let him keep your life.